into Paris tonight. So welcome to the wonderful world of consulting. So with that, I want to introduce Manuel, and I will let him give a little bit more background on himself, and Chris can do the same. And appreciate your attention throughout the course of the class. Good.
My name is Barbero. I'm the Managing Director and Vice President with Barbero. Chris?
My name is Chris Rosenberg. I am a Senior Manager out of the Chicago office with Barbero.
What I guess is more relevant to you is what I do and where I come from. I come from New York. I don't want to mislead you with my accent. I was actually born and trained in France. So I apologize if something don't come across right. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. And I'm known for putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. So it's very difficult for me. My wife was from Detroit, so I'm to myself. We half Midwesterner is making fun of me all the time. So I was traditional engineer, so you'll see a lot of quantitative and framework type of information. But for the past 11 years, I spent a lot of time in sales and marketing, so that helps also put some speed on the presentation that I do. But for the past 11 years, I've been a consulting practitioner, and everything that you heard in this course about the importance to articulate a concept once you arrive at them is absolutely fundamental. Whether it's in the sales phase or the presentation, knowing what you want to say it, and tell people what you said is the essence of what is important in business. It's even more so in consulting, where our core mission is to reduce complexity to something that you can handle. And you can handle in the short term in a practical way. So what I'm hoping to do in this presentation is, this was the assignment I was given, is to talk to you about tools and techniques to drive insight from data, how you synthesize data, and how you structure your findings so that it can be articulated to another audience. So what I'm hoping we can go over is a number of things, from collecting information to analyzing in a critical fashion, and then how you present them. But we'll see, this is the overall story. So what is it that I'm hoping we can do? First is, the best way to frankly show you how, from a practical standpoint, we extract data and present it, to show you what we call best practices, which is consultants for saying, what we estimate are the best thing they can be replicated. My emphasis, because I have no pretension to do this in an academic way, is to you suggest what, from a pragmatic point, give you a lot of example. There's some theory in there. I'll point you to some documents that and write-ups and books that are absolutely fantastic, not only from what they say, but how it's presented. It's really, from a cultural standpoint, very interesting. The work of Tufte, for example, you'll see the reference in the back. But some of this will be comments and opinion. I'm not pretending that this is the ultimate in what can be presented. So I have a bias towards some things here I think will become apparent. So what I'm hoping you can get out of this is, I think we were mentioning this with Armin. In the professional world, you spend some time, you realize that there's so much information that needs to be qualified, and you need to synthesize it, that it's a little bit daunting. So what I'm hoping I can share with you is that actually there's a way to manage the madness, if you will. And there's a few things that you need to keep in mind, whether it is in collecting information, analyzing it, and presenting it, that I hope you can even apply for your last presentation today. I mean, you'll see mixed into some consideration about statistics, you'll see some practical way of presenting information using PowerPoint. I think half of the challenge sometimes is merely to make it understandable to the audience. So we'll talk about some key techniques and tools in that regard. And last but not least, I would encourage you to, as you go around, spot what you think works. Let me give you an example. If you want to present tabular data of numbers and data of this nature. Open up the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and look at how it's presented. This thing has been out for 50 years. It's been refined. It's understandable. That is the best practice right there. If you want to look at things that are done, you'll see. I'll show you some example of what not to do in the process of this. So be curious. I mean, the way I learned this is by identifying what I will refer to as patterns. And that's how you learn. This is how most of us learn in school examples. So let's talk a little bit about collecting, analyzing, and presenting information. Just to echo what was said, you know that that process, and we are in the phase where we start to analyze how to best communicate the information. Let me critique this a little bit, because obviously that's page 6 of your reference document. What is apparent from this model, and again, this is a critique, not a criticism. Did I lose already the beautiful pen that you gave me?
You must have.
The pointer. I'll get it somewhere. I know you gave it to me, but anyway, there's 3 things here that assume a linear approach to problem solving. You'll see in real life, and I'm sure you were told this, there's a lot of back and forth that happens between the phases. So I'm going to explain a little bit how to deal with this. It appears there's some clear transition point. That is something that is true, but need to be amended. In the business world, we need to organize those transition points because they're very important to go from one phase to the other. Otherwise, you can go into what we call scope creep, when the range of information you try to analyze go out of control. But usually, what I'm trying to say here is that the boundaries between the phases are a little bit porous. And what this says here is that you go from the general to the specific, and then again to the recommendation. There are examples where this process is not exactly like this, where you actually start with an intuition, and then you go back and resolve it. We're going to see look into this. I'll talk a little bit about the design for Six Sigma because it has some relevance with this process. So the point of this slide is this is already highlight a couple of components of the methodology that you can use, and with some assumptions. The other thing that I also find interesting in those charts is that when they represent circular motion like this, you have to ask yourself, is it really a circle? Do you have to, the issue here is that do you go from communicate to prepare? I think this chart would be equally powerful if you actually represent it 3 steps, because you don't actually erase, which seldom do it again. That's a detail, but we're going to go over the subtleties of using graphics for what you want to present. That suggests an iterative process. Sometimes you don't use actually, it's not iterative necessarily. So one other way to look at this process is to be aware that frankly there's a hierarchy of concepts here. The hierarchy that leads from mere data, and I think I totally concur with what was said about the importance of getting access to primary data. The communication you have with people, once you know this thing, is always, when you study a topic, talking to the people who actually know this is far more useful than any kind of research you do. This is where you really get your insight. Then you have to filter the data so that you can establish that they are really facts. Sometimes they're not, they can be opinion. Then if you look at the pattern across fact, you will get something that is really information and a good synthesis of this. And if you're good, if the process works well, you will be able to reuse this information in the form of knowledge and hopefully the form of wisdom. So you need to know which, in your professional life or even when you do study, I think it's important that you qualify the information to know where you are in this process. What I encourage you is to make sure that across everything you do, you try to accumulate this level of knowledge and intelligence in the process. What does that mean? What it means is that, for example, in consulting, we're very we ask very often to analyze issues, and what you bring in the process is a set of reference material that is the embodiment of your knowledge. And this is why you see the domain of knowledge management being so important in consulting, because you frankly want to build on previous knowledge. In fact, that's what Chris Rosenberg does for our practice, and this accumulation of knowledge is very important. So this is fine and dandy, but so what? Well, I'm going to show you a couple of tools that help you organize the information like this. And I think one of the way that I want to present this is in the form of a case study of we helping an organization define what kind of feature is new. I think this one is, let's take this was actually for Champaign. So we had to advise them on, okay, what exactly do you want your new phone system to do? Seems like a trivial question, but it's really not, because there's a number of things that gets into the picture as to how you support your internal clients, external clients. So what you, and this is very similar to the issue tree, except it's kind of the issue tree the other way around. What you start doing is talking to people, and you actually get them the quotes. Now, what you will see is that these kind of quotes usually reflect what people want. Be careful not to confuse what they want and what they need. In fact, I'm going to show you how you can diagram that out. But the first thing, as I said, is first start with the fact and collect them in form of data. And usually what works best when you present to the executive is, okay, those are the exact quotes of what people said. That goes back to the comment we were making earlier about your primary source, very important. So this is when the magic happens. You want to aggregate those themes in the form of, well, actually, those quotations in the form of themes. And this is really where your analytical and your good judgment comes into motion, and you organize those in the form of, frankly, a sort of a requirement tree. In this particular case, what we were trying to do is to specifically focus on several items in the what I call the problem space, and all those quotations here were relative to a specific feature of the phone system, namely the voicemail. So right there you have one thing that's important. That there is a lot of that we elaborate using what we call an affinity diagram that enables you to translate what you saw before in a collection of very specific features. For example, in a voicemail system, you need to have things that makes it possible to operate in an efficient manner. So you want to be able to, when the user gets and travel around the world, when they sit down in whether it's Paris or London, in that case London and New York, they want to be able to have access to the same kind of features. There seems a little bit more trivial things such as, of course, you want the system to be 24/7. So one thing I recommend when we gather information like this is it's a combination of things that really emanate from the user directly and put together in a structured manner. Now, just again from a presentation standpoint, when you are in front of executives and you have to present, this is what we heard. This is a very powerful way of doing it for this reason, because it is grounded into what the direct feedback you have from the user group and organized in the way they can relate to. There's about 6 steps in this. This is the next step. Obviously, you want to rate and organize this information. Remember, the transition from fact to information is really what the magic happens. One technique you can use that is part of a broader framework known as the design for Six Sigma. I'll talk about this a little bit later. Well, you want to put some, assign some kind of weight to those using a scale, and this is the one we use. One means like there's something that's really going to get people excited. People, number 5 is something that is frankly something you must have. One example is you will see is 24/7 every meeting. And then from 2 to 3 and 4 you have performance, meaning that you will see that 2 is something that is both exciting and is required. And there's some gradation between those components. I want to make a remark now. You might observe that those numbers, although they are numeric numbers, they don't necessarily function as a suite. In other words, 2 is not necessarily better than 1. 3 is not necessarily, it happened that 3 and 4 are better than respectively 2 and 3, but this is a typical example of what we call a dummy variable. And you will see later on some example of use of statistics on dummy variable that are very misleading. This is a coding, I would call it ABCD. Be careful about the use of numbers in statistics when there is example of dummy variable I used to do average, which are meaningless. You'll see an example. Anyway, so this is how it works. We plot the ratings along two axes. We essentially rate what are the needs and what are the wants. And you will end up, you'll see in the example, into several clusters. You have the basic things that frankly people will be thankful they exist, but they're not going to be widely excited about them. The fact that your telephone works in a brain 24 hours, 7 days a week is sort of a basic requirement. Then you're going to have things which are a little bit more exotic, and people will say, well, this is wonderful, it really gets me excited, but frankly, they're not very useful. It won't translate to productivity. The one that you really want to use are the one that both represent a need and will translate, it will reflect something that's specifically required by your user base, but also have a strong impact. This simple exercise of trying to translate what people said across those two scales is itself something that can take several iterations, multiple work groups, but fundamentally it leads to these kind of things. For example, the ability to create and broadcast messages. That's something that gets the CEO very excited. He wants to be able, or she wants to be able to send a message to the entire population of the bank saying, tomorrow we'll make this kind of announcement. It's an excitement for the CEO. Is that something that fundamentally will change the way the organization functions? Sometimes, but it's kind of a nice to have. So that's why it's classified 1. Excuse me, this is, it goes the other way around. I'm afraid I just got things swept. So those are some examples of how these were rated, and this is the outcome of this exercise. Not surprisingly, there are several level of criticality of those features, ranging from the ability to have timely message being delivered. You want a message to be voicemail to be readily accessible when you drop them. To things which are much more more exotic, if you will. For example, one-touch reply message when you hit the phone and immediately it rings to whoever called you. Now, the relevance for you of this kind of analysis is this is a good example of two things. One is how you take a massive amount of stuff, namely opinions from end users, and how you translate that visually to an audience so that they can make informed decisions. The value add of an exercise like this is that it helps, as I said, people make informed decision by, there's a lot of information in this chart, but it enables the executive to really look at them in the form of clumps. And then what we tell them is that, okay, look guys, your system has to do that for sure. Then let's see which vendor can help you do this. And the last thing in the list that you would want your vendors to do in your new system is this kind of thing. So right there you have the foundation for writing what we call a request for proposal, an RFP, to solicit vendors to develop those systems. Let me make a couple of comments on this diagram itself. It has some visual features that I want to comment on. This is, generally speaking, a good example, I think, of having a strong but relatively, I wouldn't say hidden, but discrete framework. In other words, you have two grayish axes, you have the underlying colors, but that's not something that's overpowered the information. You have also a lot of granular information. So you have, for example, the entire list of 50 or 60 features. This is a good example of managing complexity just from a visual standpoint, because you have a framework which is very strong. At the same time, there's a balance between the concept, which is the 5 main area of features, and the specific of it. You will find that this is a feature of a good chart, something that has a very strong but discrete, not overpowering framework, along with a wealth of information that is relevant. And you will see some example of bad charts that have everything backwards, with strong overpowering framework with little information. We will see that later on in this presentation. The other point I want to make for this chart is that when it comes to visual presentation, what you have to remember is the following. When you have textual information, less is more. But when you have visual presentation, less is more. So, and you'll see, my chart, I'm famous for, people say that I tend to overdo my charts, and my saying is that a pixel is a terrible thing to waste. But when it comes to charts, I'm actually partial to the fact that too many times we see charts that are frankly not simple, they're simplistic. And evidently, I don't think that's a good idea. Anyway, now let's do something a little bit more subtle in the this layering of data. How do you? Okay, fine. This is what you want to do. You want to have a system, in that case, a branch telephone system that has a couple of features. Okay, fine. Now you turn to the engineer and you tell them this is what I want. Then they have to decide, okay, but what kind of technology feature do I want to have to make that happen? So, and this is another interesting domain, because the challenge that you have here is to link what is it that you want to the how. How do you accomplish this? And we're going to use a technique that is known as quality function deployment. It's a term that originated in manufacturing when auto manufacturer had the same kind of challenge. They knew that people were ready to buy certain feature in a car, but they had to find out, how do I get it? For example, how exactly is the first time impression of the buyer going into a car affected? What is it exactly? What is this? When the customer or the future customer step into a car, what makes he or her decide, I feel good about this car? Evidently, what the marketeers wanted to do is to make sure that this first impression was positive, and this is the what. So now they had to research what exactly makes that difference. Well, it was a combination of things. It would be accessibility. It would be, do I have room for my bag? And I'm suggesting that this is true for both genders, but I think some of us have bags of larger size than others. So the notion of having, for example, if you're targeting a certain segment of the population, the right room for your bag, it makes a big difference whether or not they're going to be bought. They even make the finding that actually the smell of the car make a difference. These new car smells actually make people feel better. So what I'm trying to do now is establish a linkage between what you want to establish versus how you're going to do this. Well, it's a pretty tedious exercise, but this is what you do. You list all the what that you wanted. So that is an excerpt of the list you had before. You're going to try to say, okay, of all the things that I can do, for example, from a technology standpoint or feature standpoint, for my voicemail system, what are the features that are possibly related to this? Example, you want to be able to make a one-way enhancement to the entire firm. That's a what. As we saw before, this is a relatively important feature, and there's a desired functionality, I should say, and this is related to a number of things. For example, you need to be able to manage an enterprise list of users. You need to be able to I mean, that's the one that's most likely directed to that particular feature. So what you do is a relatively simple exercise. I'm not going to go into the details, but this is life in consulting. You actually go and spend time with the users, well, actually in that case the technology group, and you say, okay, what of all the things that you do here, what is likely to work? For example, there was a functionality that through the system, through the approach that we mentioned before, established that creating a message and send broadcast was important. So that's this line. So of all those things here, we established, okay, of all the feature of your phone system, which one is likely to be related? Well, we find that creating and sending broadcast message is strongly facilitated by the ability to dial by name, which is this column. So here you put a weight, and again, the weight is somewhat arbitrary. In that case, we use 0, 1, and 0, 1, 3, and 5. And then when you sum up this, this way actually here, you have de facto a ranking of what matters to your phone system. You know, when I started in consulting, this kind of analysis I thought was almost trivial, because yeah, that's probably the way I would have done it anyway. For anybody with somewhat of a scientific background or technology background, you would say, yeah, that's sort of trivial. That's the way I would do it. To those people, being an engineer myself, I'll say, yeah, I'm glad you're thinking this way. Making it happen requires a kind of discipline and explanation to the end users that is not trivial. In other words, what you will find in the majority of your client and target audience is that they're not used to this kind of systematic analytic process of organizing information. So don't underestimate how important it is to present a framework to your audience. It's not as obvious that it would be for somebody with more of a systematic, I would say, analytical background. Anyway, so this is a way to go from, as you heard, data to fact to information. Now you have the information as to how you should select your PBX, your phone system. And at the end of the day, those translate into what is known in Six Sigma as the critical to quality factors, actually organized by relevance, which is always a good thing. And I just listed that because those are excerpted from an actual client engagement. So what I wanted to do here is to give you a real life example of how you derive information from fact in a domain where frankly you start with massive amount of information, a lot of opinion, and frankly in a way that is usable for consumption by executives that usually have limited attention span. Let me give you another example of how another tool that is useful. And this is the context. The context is the following. In many cases in life or in consulting, you have to organize concept in terms of relevance. Very hard. Because the human mind, and generally speaking, the reality makes it very difficult to compare a list of things. And again, the relationship is not always what's called transitive, meaning that A might be better than B, and B might be better than C. Doesn't not automatically mean that A is better than C. That works well in math, but it doesn't work like this in real life. So you are presented with an issue. The following issue is that you have presented with a list of objectives. You're interviewing the CFO, the CEO of an organization, and you ask them, so what do you want to do with your company? What are your strategic goals? And they will give you a laundry list of objectives, right? Well, this was an actual case where we were working with, or maybe that's somebody you know, it's Sally May, who does actually loan for students. And this is 6-7 years ago, so I can talk about this, but they say, okay, we want to have a growth in the number of loans that we're offering. We want to distantiate ourselves from competition. So there's a list. I mean, the specifics are not necessarily relevant. So in order for us to have an informed decision as to what it really matters, we had to, first step, even try to organize this in terms of priority. And nobody can really do this just by having the list. Okay, this is the important thing here. You can always compare two things. You can always say that one thing is better than the other, more important. Binary association is something that the mind does very well. When it gets more complicated is when you have a list. So this is what you do. Again, without having the listing, you essentially have what you use is called pairwise comparison matrix. So if you say, for example, the grown loan volume, how important is this vis-a-vis developing or maintaining the securitization market? That particular feature, I could comment on what it is, but it's not important for the purpose of this presentation. What it says here is that this grown loan volume is way more important than this feature. Now this is a symmetrical matrix, so for example, if something here is a 5, you will find here the reverse, the 0.2 factor. And what you do at the end is you add up across the board here, and you'll find out that automatically you have a list that is actually organized by importance. So again, at the risk of being repetitive, do not, this is something that most of us, or some of us, would naturally do in the context of trying to problem finding. This is, the pairwise comparison is something that's very important to organize, again, information that that the user themselves, people who provide you this information, are not likely to be able to do that. Question? Suggestion? I just realized I've been talking for a good 20 minutes, and I better pause here at this point to see two things. Number one, is this of relevance to you? And number two, do you have a specific question on what I've presented so far? Go ahead.
Do you use this for hierarchy models or something like that?
Yes. You know, in the reason why we started here in that particular case was that the company retained us to do a technology strategy. And you can see how this early step to be used in building a business strategy altogether. But even when you do a technology strategy, you want to start with what are the so-called business drivers. And so this was part of our normal due diligence step to say, okay, let's just make sure that we know where you want to go from a strategy standpoint. So this is part of a larger process to establish what is the baseline strategy of that particular organization. Anybody? So far so good? Yes? Okay.
So the fact base that you use to come up with those comparisons, can you
How do
talk
you
a
do
little
that?
bit about,
Okay,
you know,
well, no, that's very important, the mechanics. Well, again, this is something from the consulting world. And it's intuitively obvious, but not necessarily easy to do. Obviously, as a consultant or as a manager, you don't want to do this just in your office. This is going to be completely irrelevant. You won't get the buy-in from the so-called stakeholders. So the way we make our money as consultants is that we establish the framework, put people in the room, and we ask them. So literally what we do is that, what do you think? So is this more important, less important? We go through a sort of a voting exercise that presumably accomplishes two things. Number one, you have primary information, because that's what people tell you. They think this is much more important than the other. Number two, it's something that by the time you're done with this exercise, you're done. I mean, there's no, the result emerges automatically. Number three, you develop a sense of ownership by the stakeholders that was something that they developed. So they're more likely to serve as agent of change and promote those findings than if it was imposed by an external source or even by management itself. So the process itself is through facilitated discussion. By the way, there's software that do that automatically. When you plug in this information, presented with nice charts right away. This is PowerPoint-based presentation that excerpted this information. So you go from using a simple ranking system, as I said, to comparing pairwise. and that ends up with a ranking of your business theme. And you can do that with practically anything. And you will probably, I don't know if you interviews in interviews that you were mentioned before in case resolution, you will end up with having to sort out through facts or recommendation. You might want to use this technique just to present an organized priorities. Because one thing you're going to find out, and you probably know, is that having a laundry list of recommendations is fine. Each of them come probably with some kind of cost. So you need to establish what is the best bang for your buck, and organizing them by priorities is something that enables you to make to finalize those recommendations. All right. Another point I want to make about this chart, again, the theme here is that relatively light framework. You don't see very heavy lines forming the grid of your table. You have the use of arrows to show, it helps you read through this chart, so it's less daunting. You have also something that can talk by itself. These things tell the story. The story is usually on the header. So that's also a good example, I hope, if I can say that myself, is of how to organize, again, relatively complex concept. There is enough data for you to figure out what it really means, so it's not, it's for real, if you will, and it ends up with a practical recommendation. All right, so now we talked a little bit about those tools that I mentioned, the Kano model, using voice of the customer, pairwise comparison, quality function development. I want to talk about something that's also used very pervasively to present concept processes and concept and something that helps you model what you observe. And by that I mean value chain and use case. Let me introduce the concept of value chain. I don't know to what extent this is something that a concept that you use in marketing classes or operation. Is that something you're familiar with? Okay. So let me echo what you heard. This is, for example, the actual value chain for, I think it's the same company. Yeah, it's the how you go from taking a loan, so students like you applying for a loan, all the way to doing reporting to the government about what's happening with your loan portfolio, etc. So here you have all the steps of the core value chain of this particular organization. And in parallel here you have all the supporting process. You will find that this is a very convenient way of presenting, to start the discussion about what you should do with a particular business problem. It helps in front of a C-level audience to identify and trigger the discussion as to where are the problem spots. Is it in the way you go to market and acquire those loans, and then how you market them to students, or is it an issue of servicing your loans, we're sending the bills and collecting the dues, etc. What is important that you know about value chain from a data presentation standpoint, this view is usually static. So it's something that doesn't change that much over time. Unless you really change the business model, that's going to be relatively stable. This doesn't represent what is it really happening, for example, when you take a loan application, or what is it that you do exactly when you disperse those funds to people who apply. So that is another construct that is called a use case. Again, what I'm trying to do here is to give you a number of buzzwords that you're likely to encounter, whether you go in consulting or technology development, etc. For anybody here been doing software development in the previous life? No? Well, you're going to encounter, it's not only in a software development environment, you're going to find that in a number of domains, there's this weird expression, they call it use case. And don't ask me why, but it's how you call it user case or scenario, etc. That's the actual term that is used, use case. And this is what happens. For each of the chevron of your value chain, you say, okay, what's really happening? Well, what you do is you have a little diagram that says, okay, this is an actor. What happened is a student applied and gets some backing from a guarantor, and you need also to have some information that comes from the school at which you apply, and that goes back to the person that actually received the money, which may or may not be the same as the person who applied for it. Now, this relatively trivial construct that I'm presenting here is nothing else but saying who does what to whom and how. Is actually the fundamental decomposition of what all the process in the organization can be, the construct that can be used to present all of the processes. So again, here the theme is, how do you describe a company like Champaign? Well, what you do is that you first build a framework of what is your value chain, and within those you identify and document what are the key use cases. So typically for a company like Champaign, you end up with about 50 use cases that comprehensively describe the entire organization. I don't know if that's relevant to the case that you have to deal with Walmart and that you're working on, but that's a good series of tools that you can use to, again, reduce the complexity of what you want to present. If you want to describe a company like Walmart, it's extremely complex to do even with a set of diagrams or a narrative. What you can say, okay, Walmart has essentially this kind of value chain, and within those are the main components. So, this is also very important when you do, by the way, software development, and you will find yourself in a position as executives to have to manage people who do IT. And the concept of use case is very important to establish a dialogue and interaction between management and the IT people. This is when the magic happens, when you have to have those group of people to interact. Otherwise, it's very complex to explain to one another what on the one hand they want and what they're going to get. Now let me make that a little bit more real, because you're going to say, okay, fine, those are little nifty diagrams. And by the way, this is actually the way it's usually presented. The little stick figures is the established norm for those. And I remember when I first saw that, I said, it's not very sophisticated. Believe me, that's actually when you buy a package that helps you do this, that's the way it looks. So let me, of course we're not going to go line by line, but this is how the use case really looks like. What you do is that those are called swim lane diagrams. And what it means is like, okay, those are all the actors, and the actors can be people or systems. It could be organization, it could be anything that interact with anything else. And what you have here, you have a timeline that goes from top to bottom. And it essentially says, okay, those are the interactions between the actors, and eventually what are the systems which are impacted. The specifics of this particular presentation are not relevant, but I wanted to give you an example of how you can manage complexity of describing an organization from the very high static model on the value chain to the specific of what really happened, which are the use case representation, to the actual narrative that you present with along with the use case. If you are in a position to be the internal customer or the external customer for a software development process, you will deal with this kind of models that enable you to establish the communication with your suppliers. What I think is interesting with this kind of diagram and concept is that it really helps validate facts with your audience. If you were to, for example, do this, if you analyze how the consumer walk into Walmart, interact with the store itself, you might want to represent that as one of use case. What happens when you come in, and you will be able to diagram out what are the various steps that the consumer goes through. That would be relatively trivial. But imagine if you had to represent what happens when something goes wrong. For example, what happens when a potential buyer walks in and does not find what he or she wants. Diagramming what really happens in terms of who you escalate to, who you ask, what happens after that, that's really the only way to really find out what really happens and what should happen. And those tools, this particular use case, which we will call customer comes in, doesn't find what he wants, documenting this is a very good, for example, what we do is that we would have a store manager, somebody working the floor, and somebody, and people who have actually shop at this particular store, we put them all together and we ask, so what do you think happens? And you would be very surprised that in general, the store manager doesn't have the same story as the person who is working the floor or the customer himself or herself. This is another tool to reduce ambiguity by facilitating communication. And what I'm presenting here is the way to formalize it by documenting. Again, from a graphic standpoint, you have also some very good feature of a diagram here, which is a combination of a narrative that can be used and looked at for in-depth understanding. And you have a visual that actually intuitively represent what we want to say. And altogether, that helps having reliable documentation going forward. I'm trying to link up the two concepts here, the one that we saw before, which is pairwise comparison and use case. If say you have an analysis to make on Walmart, you end up with those 50 use cases. So how, you have the time to even develop 50 use cases? You usually know. And we were confronted with that issue here with this particular client, Sally Mae. And what we did is, before we go into documenting those use cases, what we did is a pairwise comparison between what you think are the most important. And this is the list that we came up with. So we knew that what was very important for us to do is to document the one that had the highest impact. So you can see how those combination of tools can work together. All right, let me pause it a little bit because what I went over is a lot of tools that has to do with how to capture information, present it, analyze them, prioritize the fact. And this is very much aligned to what you've heard so far about having a linear approach to problem solving, starting from the beginning, trying to find out what you want to say, what you want to find out, all the way to presenting it. I want to say into a little comments on non-linear approach to this kind of problem resolution. Pause a little bit, number one, so I can breathe a little bit, and second, to hear your feedback and or questions. Is it Thursday afternoon or is it?
Yeah, you know, they're pretending to be shy.
Okay. All right, let me suggest something. This is something that I think is gained more relevance with books like I don't know if you read or saw the book by the name of Link. Does that ring a bell? This is the concept I'm going to talk about is something that is called expert intuition. That's not the way he calls it, but and I have a reference book in the back that the original person who came up with the concept at Columbia University. But this is the way it works. In most cases, when you have a problem to solve or an issue to discuss, it's very rare that you actually go through the linear process of saying, okay, what is it that we need to solve, decompose it into an issue tree, analyze the component leaves of the issue tree, synthesize, etc. That is something you should do systematically when you really are new to the problem space. And I'm not going to undermine one entire trimester of learning by suggesting that there's anything wrong with it. What I'm saying is that sometimes
It's a school of thought.
it's a school of thought. What I'm saying is that in many cases, this is what happens. Presumably, you already have an idea of what the solutions are. In fact, in many cases, there's only a limited, discrete number of solutions to the problem you're dealing with. the true of thought is the following. You should have an intuitive way of saying, okay, there's 3 solutions to this problem. So you're going to jump from what I call 1, which is problem, what is the problem you're trying to solve, and instead of going to step 2, decomposing this into sub-issue 3, analyzing them, etc., what you do is you do 1, what are the possible solutions? 10. And then you work backwards. And you say, okay, assuming that is the solution, let me see if that actually jives with what I know about the problem. So that's what we call 1, 10, 8, 9, 10. And it's based on the fact that at any given point in time, if you know the subject matter, you probably have an idea about the possible solution are, and it prevents you from what we call boiling the ocean. Because of course a systematic approach to problem resolution that decompose the issues into with a level of granularity that it can be dealt with individually is something that is systematic and exhaustive. There's just so many constraints on your time or resources you have to address those kind of issues, and you need to leverage what you already know, your expert intuition. Yes?
How maybe I can ask later, but how do you communicate that to your client? Because most of the time rational models are appreciated more than the expert intuition. So you need to back up your.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that person?
Let me let on a couple of secrets. Number one, when you are recruited as a consultant, the assumption is you actually know what you're talking about. So that means that people, more and more clients, tell us, no, I don't want to explain to you my what we call the current state. I'm assuming you know. And I'm not gonna explain to you the entire dynamics of the market. I'm assuming you know. I'm going to tell you very briefly what my problem is, and I'm assuming that because you've done that before with other clients and you have a general idea what I do, you can give me the 5 or 6 things that I should do. And frankly, I think I agree with those guys, because the clients, because frankly, if we're as good as we think we are, the pattern that we see should emerge relatively quickly. If you pay somebody, I mean, this is a very different business model. You can have a business model where you have a lot of people crunching numbers and going linearly in the problem resolution. But as a customer, what do you get out of this? You get a lot of people very, very smart about what you do. But you already know. And furthermore, not only, and it will be very well documented. The problem is that you don't want what you have. So you're going to have a lot of documentation on something you don't want. You have trained your vendor in your consultant very well so that they can go and sell it somewhere else, but you have 0 as a result. So there's one aspect of things that I want to say is that more and more when you bring in a specialist and an expert, the assumption is that they can have this kind of what I call expert intuition to directly identify what are the possible options. But then this is your question. That's fine, but then those are opinions. What you want is that your consultant to go back, and this is the 8, 9, 10 step, to validate what you have against facts. So it's the combination of intuitive reasoning that leads you to possible conclusion, backed by a systematic analysis of those options that together provide you with a solution that faster and presumably cheaper in terms of resources. There's some drawbacks to this, and I listed here. You don't know if it's the best absolute decision, because you might not have in the initial, you say there's only 4 or 5 ways to do this. Well, you might miss the 5th or 6th that your intuition doesn't know. It's very difficult to demonstrate. The only way to exhaustively demonstrate that the solution is best is presumably to go to the step 1, 2, 3, to 10. So by definition, this is a heuristic. It's not meaning that it's a way of solving the problem in a way that we know works, but we don't know exactly why, and we're not pretending we know why and how it really functions. And frankly, in popular parlance, that means like you jump into conclusions. So it's an art. But this notion of going 1, 10, 8, 9, 10 is a very powerful way that you probably think, that's probably the way you already think. And I'm going to give you an example. So what I'm trying to say here is that you need to determine the course of your career or the exposure or problem solving, what is the best method. If you're facing a problem you've never seen, that your client had no idea how to solve, it's pretty unique, or that the data is unclear, you want, of course, to give yourself you want to have the intellectual property of going through the systematic steps. However, there's something that is called judgment that you need to be comfortable to invoke in problem solving when you know the context, when you've seen it before, and if you are retained as an expert. Just in concluding this particular slide, because then we're going to see an example, is the following. I'm sure in your strategy class, you've been exposed to the concept of establishing a parallel between strategy and tactics and the military field, right? Strategy, generalship in Greek. Strategy is the art of winning the war before it's fought, as opposed to tactics, the art of winning the war, the battle as it's being fought. So there's a natural corresponding set of notions between the military field and business. And there's also a connotation, I'm not going to go into this. But that's the guy who came up with the notion of intuitive expertise or expert judgment, and analyzed a lot of the writings and the Napoleonic Wars. And he coined, actually it's Clausewitz who was fighting on the other side and wrote a book on war. This is where, by the way, the expression the fog of war comes from. And in there, Clausewitz, who was working for the Prussian, said that Napoleon had a fantastic coup d'oeil. Coup d'oeil is French for glance. So what we were saying is that Napoleon was very good at very quickly size the situation, decide whether he would fight or not, how he would fight, etc. Now, I'm sure what the point here is that he obviously would then have a mastery of the logistics, and he had an entire apparatus of an organization that could help him execute. But his genius was in very rapidly looking at a situation and come up with an intuition that was working. And I don't want to elaborate too much on this. I recommend really that you read the book that Dr. Dankin wrote. Bill, it happens to be a neighbor too, but it's called The Art of What Works, where he really goes into what was his expert intuition. And that's, as I said, something that was also popularized by the Blink book, much more successfully from a marketing standpoint. But that is the concept. So,
Emmanuel, I guess even as you use that, it might be a different terminology. I think about the guys at McKinsey. They take like what I call a hypothesis-driven approach, which I think is somewhat similar to that. To say, look, I've had guys at McKinsey tell me, go out on a study, maybe they do a 4 to 6 week study. They say that they're going to sit down with their partner 2 days in and talk about what their hypotheses are about what the answer is.
Yep.
Within 2 days, they should have that hypothesis.
that's what we do. In consultant engagement, particularly in strategy, there's always 2 threads of activity. One is public, one is done. By that I mean, and I'm sure you remember that, there is, you sit down with your consultant and your executive, and they expect you in 2 days, they will formulate hypotheses that are, and because that's what you're being paid. You say, well, listen, I mean, there's only 6 ways of doing this, whole market the same problem, that's what they did, didn't work for this, etc. So that's the expert knowledge that you bring to the table. But you cannot go and declare that's going to be your conclusion. Number one, you haven't really validated it. Number two, any kind of solution to be effective in terms of implementation requires a lot of buy-in. Buy-in from the stakeholders, people in the organization, external parties, etc. So, I mean, I hate to put it this way, but you need to give them the impression that they arrive at that conclusion. And so there's two parallel processes here. One is at the executive level, where you need to iterate this process. And actually, it's not for 2 days. 2 days you get the hypothesis, and you continue to work with them until you refine. At the same time, you have a process which is much more systematic that goes and hopefully converges to the same solution. But it has a different time scale. Actually, in the case of McKinsey, not that I want to disparage competitive firms, so we're not exactly in the same field. Actually, that's what they do. They would do this. McKinsey prides itself, and probably rightly so, for the systematic, rigorous, analytical process they go to define solutions. So they will subject your organization to this meticulous, systematic, exhaustive process whereby you have this decomposition. They would say, one of your objectives is to increase the widget sales, and this is everything you're going to do to get there. So that's almost issue tree, right? So that's what you buy when you buy McKinsey. They will lead you through the systematic process, and they will involve a lot of the people of the organization. What an alternative way of doing this is, as I suggested, you talk to people and say, what do you observe works? And then you synthesize this to a recommendation. At the end of the day, those are very different approaches in problem solving and solution identification. I think the consultant world has been plagued by too many of this and not enough of this. And this is why the ultimate example of this issue here is that the joke is that consultant are people who ask for your watch to tell you what time it is. And when you think about it, that's a little bit what it is. I mean, if you only provide a framework for collecting information, organizing it, and then regurgitating you in the form of nice PowerPoint, your value added has been limited. And I think what has been flagged the organization a lot is those large projects where there's a lot of effort and energy and resources dedicated to documenting what's called the start state, and not enough into intuitively propose alternatives and hypotheses. So I think from a marketing standpoint, this notion of we will help you by doing 1, 10, 8, 9, 10 is a very powerful one. I think that's what you get when you hire the right consulting organization. But the money that a lot of organizations unfortunately do is organizing this kind of gigantic boiling the ocean process, which I think is give a bad name to consulting equipment.
Because essentially you can do the left side, right? But then say for the actions, the things we really need to look at, say based on my hypotheses, I'm only going to look at 3 of those things in their
and
actions, right?
Here you have a process that says top down. Somebody decided that's what we want to do, and then it imposes on people what to do. And this is the notion of mutually exclusive, globally comprehensive approach to problem resolution. Well, you're much better off asking people in the field, what do you think we really should do? Without any agenda. Remember when we were talking about, what kind of feature you want for your telephone system? That is a very different approach. In fact, if you read look at this reference here. There's an entire chapter of the McKinsey way of problem resolution and why it can be critiqued, if you will. Now, the example I wanted to give you is this one. It's pretty popular in France, and there's a reference in another book that I mentioned here that has to do with fluid reasoning. And this is how it works. Imagine that you have a 3-digit number and a set of randomly picked number, and if you have, so let's say 592. Okay, this is how it works. Okay, you have to arrive at 592 using a combination of multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction using the 6th number below. Let me give you like 20 seconds. See, this is the interactive part of the class. who have it, raise your hands. Anybody? Okay, sorry.
They think they're-
Can you repeat the number?
What?
Can you just one number twice?
No. Use the number only once.
Yeah, that would be,
All right. So, okay, you got it? Okay, let's go.
I think, 50 times 10,
Uh-huh.
understand those, plus 9 times 10. Ah, right, yes.
Ah. All right. Anybody else?
I got it.
Okay.
It's,
Can I use this marker?
Yeah, yeah, sure. why not?
Wet erase mine.
Yeah, go.
Okay. Let me write it. Tell me what it is. Go ahead.
it's the quantity 50 plus 9
Uh-huh.
times 10 plus 1 plus 3 over 3.
Plus 3 over 3. Alright, so 59 is 590, 590, 1 plus 1. Bravo! Now let me ask you how you got there.
Well, there were a couple of ways to start. It's about 600.
Ah!
About 600 is about 60 times 10. So it seemed that I couldn't add those numbers together and get 600. There had to be some kind of multiplication. There's a lot of ways to get 600, but the 50 and the 10 stood out, so it was probably close to one of those. It might be times 9 or times 12.
You know, it's beautiful. And we didn't rehearse. I don't know this gentleman. But exactly the point that you're making. You're starting with something close enough. 600. And then from there you say, okay, how do I do 600 or close? So then you go back to your facts, namely the numbers you have, and you kind of scramble while they are, and you iterate between those until you have a sort of a number of hypotheses, and coupling it together, you arrive at the result. That is very different from what a computer would do. Actually, this can be emulated by a computer. What, if you read the book, Fluid Analogy by Hofstadter, who is the same guy who wrote another book that I really recommend, which is Gödel, Escher, and Bach, about patterns, essentially. This is the way the human brain functions. Is that you get close enough to an hypothesis, you backtrack to see what you can do with what you have, and you go back. A computer, a primitive computer system would have the crunching and the brute force capability of establishing and look at all the possibilities and very quickly arrive at the same solution. And would tell you whether there's how many ways there is to arrive at the solution, whether or not whatever you come up with is the closest possible solution. But that's not the way you function. So that's beautiful, a good example. I was hoping somebody would go like this. This is a good example of how to do problem resolution, which is not linear, but more like 1, 10, 8, 9, 10. All right. We already viewed the next slide that talked about go back. Beauty of the Microsoft system. There with me. Alright, playing down.
you could just hit escape.
Think so?
That's
I
it.
tried that. Those are my 2 kids. And the guy on the upper right is our CEO. You never know who's going to walk in your office. It turns out that he has the office next door to me. Literally next door. Don't ask why. It had nothing to do with rank. It was like attributed like randomly, but I'm on the 14th floor, it's 57th, you know, it's next door. You never know. I have another one that I
Is that brown nosy?
but you know, and that's on tape. And then you can go Harriet. Alright, I'm going back.
Are you still running Windows 2000?
Isn't it a shame? I know it's embarrassing, isn't it? It's
And the
called
university is Windows 2000 or 2003.
yeah.
No, well, we're XP mostly, but all the software is.
You know, it's all about the shoemakers having the kids without shoes, right? So
It's a software integration.
we're terrible at this. Anyway, so what I talked about the nonlinear problem resolution and an example, generally speaking, that you're always better off when you try to boil the ocean. You really seek primary knowledge and intuition. And number one, look at your trust your intuition and your judgment, and also derive things from facts by trying to look at the patterns in general. I want to talk about something, and I don't know if it will be a good time to pause after this. I don't know. There's something, and I don't want to confuse everything, but let me share also something that is that has nothing to do. It has to do with how you implement solutions. It might sound a little bit theoretical, and I hope you would find later on in your professional life more relevant. It might be difficult for you to completely relate to this, but let me tell you something that I see. Assume that you have a solution. How do you implement it? That's immediately a very broad question. But this is what we found. Assume that you have a thick, actually this is something that I urge you to utilize for your final. Imagine you have a very nice set of conclusions. This is what you really should do. Okay? You will find out that in many cases you cannot do this because you don't have the resources, you don't have, maybe you will invoke the use of technology that is not mature enough yet. Maybe you haven't convinced the management or the people to do it. So you have all sort of issues why, although they're very good for accommodation, you cannot implement what we call the end state. This is what we recommend. Establish what you want to do, establish the end state, and then backtrack and establish what is it that you can do as a first plateau. In other words, what is the first step? What is it that you can do now with the current resources, with the current buy-in of the organization, with the current technology that you can do between now and 3 months, so that when you're there, you re-establish where you are. First, look at what you established as your end state. You look and check whether what you had already so imagined as being your second step and your third step was directionally correct, and then you make the adjustment. So in other words, it's like the joke of how do you eat an elephant, the answer being like one bite at a time. But it's very important that you should know that a lot of organizations get bogged down into details, get bogged down into discussion about how they're going to accomplish the end state. And it's futile. In my practice, when we develop recommendation, we don't elaborate too much on the end state because there's so many things that you don't know by the time you do this. It's futile to over-engineer or to try to define what your end state is going to be with any level of details that are irrelevant for you. Where you want to spend time is on the first plateau. What is it, the first thing? So, give you a hint when you present 2 or 3 weeks from now, make sure that you document what is your first plateau and second plateau is. Because that's what really matters. Document what your end state is going to be or should be, but don't try to overdo it because you will find yourself asking questions you cannot possibly answer at this stage. So the reason why I think it's a little bit confusing is because what I just demonstrated here is that to find a solution, the end state, do the 1, 10, 8, 9, 10. To identify what you should do next, it's a 1, 10, 1, 2, 3. So the conclusion to this is when you want to envision the future, spend time on trust your intuition and don't boil the ocean. when you actually implement or plan or develop your first steps, be realistic about what's going to happen in the short term. All right, maybe we'll have a little pause here. We have still probably an hour and 15 to 20 minutes worth of material. I'm going to talk now. I'm going to talk later about more tool techniques and what it means to have the right data to make the decision. Should we pause for what's customary?
The beginning is not so, because, I mean, you can, it has to be somewhere when you're starting to do research, right? Not the kickoff meeting, when you're first discussing the scope.
Okay, when I said beginning, I just meant earlier in the project, not the very first meeting, because that'd be kind of pointless.
So like basically the midpoint deliverable and the end, somewhere around those points in the engagement plan.
That'd be the minimum.
And what's the benefit of having that? I mean, just run through quickly, any of you, what's the benefit of having this face-to-face interaction?
It's tangible. You can see the person, kind of match the face to the voice with the phone.
I think there's also, especially if you have one more towards the beginning, then there's a larger opportunity for more people on the client end to sit in on that meeting, so that people that might not be on your weekly conference calls can kind of get a feel for who you are, what you're going to do for them, and you can really have a larger relationship and build interest within the client's personnel that might want to come and join some other conference calls down the road.
Is there a team mix dynamic that you feel is stronger in terms of like undergrad, grad, engineering, or does it just require those first two traits that you talked about, dependable and self-motivated? If that, you don't care where they're from.
A good mix. I'd have to say my UIUC medical team this time around, I can already tell it's going to be an awesome group. And we have undergrads, we have graduate students,
You have a PhD too.
PhD, he helps a lot. He's and then Brian White's doing an amazing job. We're trying to do some wacky things to motivate the actual consultants to do things. So, and it's actually worked a couple of times. So.
When I first joined IBC in my first project, I don't think there were any other undergrads, and I know I looked up to all the MBAs on that project. I thought that they might have more of a clue of what they're doing, and I might have something to learn. So I did think that way, and there was a really good MBA student on my project who did a lot of work, and I think consultants in the projects don't only have to look up to the EMs, but their seniors also have to do a better job than them, or something that sets an example.
I'm going to go back a little bit to the clients in this mix. Describe the difference between a first time and a repeat client. I promise you we'll get to the end of this. 2 more questions and we're done. So what's the difference between a repeat client for IBC versus a first time client?
I just have to say that to maybe Steve, they might be repeats, but to a lot of us, you never have a repeat client. So every single client interaction you have is going to be your first time.
Repeat know the ups and downs, peaks and valleys of other like finals and midterms and things along those lines. So the explanation you can give to a first-time client, it's a little more tangible for a client.
And they understand some of the difficulties behind things that are pretty simple, like scheduling.
Yeah, absolutely. That
Um,
becomes a huge obstacle.
Right, and I think a lot of clients that haven't done this before are very surprised that the team as a whole is available maybe twice a week for an hour for a phone call or a meeting, and that's it.
I think
I mean, so the client has basically, 1 or 2 choices as far as when they want to do the conference calls.
I think repeat clients left satisfied the first time, and I think first-time clients maybe either had no other alternative or hadn't even really considered IBC, and it was really all Steve or Sarah's doing and bringing them to us. They maybe just wanted to try something new.
Great. I just wanted to now touch on a little bit about, we had talked a little bit earlier about resources, and it's what makes us strong at research and benchmarking. So what are the resources that we use well here at the university?
you say?
Bell,
The
physics and
business
economics library.
Oh,
Is it used well?
But we don't let know how to use
I
it.
know like for the first willingness needs project, we used the hell out of Bell. I mean, one source, I know Sircon and Sahil spent a couple days over there. Sahil talked to the research librarians over there a bunch. I mean,
yeah, I would say, I would go further than just saying BEL. I would say the graduate library and information science people that we have, like Carissa, for example. And then
Yeah,
just list people's on our team.
yeah.
Another thing I would say is creativity, because I don't know a few marketing projects, and that involve a lot of primary research. And students, most of them they are pretty creative in terms of marketing plan and other ideas. So I would say.
I think if I'm a client, I will go to IBC if a work requires quantifying marketing data or anything that is research, but then you need to quantify it to do the analysis.
I think another resource we have that we don't necessarily always utilize is the faculty. I've used faculty on 3 projects.
Why don't we utilize them more?
I don't know. We feel like we can handle it, or we don't necessarily know which faculty member would be the best fit to help with the project, or we don't want to disturb them because we don't think they have time to help with it.
Wait, is it emphasized enough for us to go to faculty? I mean, when I was on projects, the time I contacted faculty members I knew was when I met them in a class before IBC and knew that they might have some insight into the project that I'm doing, not something IBC encouraged or recommended.
I mean, I went to Monahan because I had a specific Excel question. I went to Broshak to get him as a general advisor on a project that was going to be designing an organizational structure for a new company. I mean, it was a more general topic, but I know he has, that's his background, he has a PhD in it, so why not go to the, best and brightest?
I agree, but we don't know all their specialties. That would be one thing why we would use them. I didn't know, or Ryan didn't know who was the guru of organizational design, and that would be why we would go.
Going back to the information library and all that stuff, is the training that we provide adequate for that?
Cheat sheet's great.
Is it utilized in your teams? Do people use it, or do you use it? Say again? The cheat sheet? Do your team members use it?
Oh, yeah, very important.
I think the in-person training could be longer. I mean,
Cheat sheet?
Yeah,
I use
but
cheat
you're-
sheet. I tell my consultants to use cheat sheet. I find out what works better is town to use a specific source. And once they go to the library, the Bell, the first time they realize what's out there, it's fine. But you just give them the cheat sheet and say use one of those, they'll just go to Google and Google it. But I tell them to use specific sources, and I want to see the site and source that they used. And once they start doing that, then it's fine.
So that's the major questions that I have right now. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't? Yeah.
I think it's kind of a question in my mind, but I tend to think that if I had more stronger team members in my project, the size is not important, but it's like, why don't we just recruit more selectively? We don't need to hire 80 consultants. It's okay if we hire 40 consultants, to my point of view, and do a great job and take more qualified projects and charge 10,000 or so for those projects. I think there is more value proposition, and with that setting, I think we can promise more to the consultants because they are doing more qualified work.
Can I build that?
Please.
I think as a engagement manager, the difference between 3 projects and 2 projects is like 4 times the work. I mean, really, that 3rd project is really a killer. 2 projects is manageable, but once that 3rd one comes in,
it's like the end of the world.
Do we need more EMs if we're gonna have more projects?
If you're gonna get a better project, have a better team experience, and really, because right now, we're just kind of treading water, but if you're really gonna improve the experience for the consultants, for the client, for the leadership team, then choose about it.
I didn't wanna say that 'cause it's on camera, but yeah, I totally agree with that. 2 projects is ideal.
Very manageable. It's
That's
tough.
consistent.
It's not just for our time schedules, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, I have no free time. Every
Yeah.
waking hour of 7 days a week is devoted to school or IBC.
and I think we're doing a disservice to the consultants who,
Yeah.
especially the ones for the first time project and they need more direction, and they kind of expect more direction from you, and you show up to a meeting, and you don't have everything exactly spelled out for how they're gonna do the research, what they're looking for.
And it makes us
they
look
get
bad.
lost, and they stop contributing.
Right, because it makes us look bad because we look unprepared and it's just, it spirals downward very quickly unless you devote, you know.
And you find yourself thinking there are 1 or 2 additional things you could do for, you know, this project and this project and this project, but you just have to skip it because you just don't
Right.
have the time or energy.
With the will.
So to make 2 projects really, really stand out versus doing 3 projects sort of at a mediocre level it's a big difference. It would be a big difference.
Now, do you feel like your projects, those of you that had 3 projects last semester, do you feel like they came out above par, or some pieces just status quo because of this jeopardy? And do you think it's even riskier now that you're getting ready to leave, your mind's checking out, things of that
I
nature?
think so. I mean, I believe that, you know, if there was more time, we could even do a much better job, and I could see what we could do with the project, but there wasn't enough time, so we kind of had to wrap it.
There was a comment made about, by Sarah about, you know, the teams that spend more time together generally tend to produce better projects. It's absolutely true. The problem that's forgotten is that you have to triple that amount of time on 3 projects, and that becomes, I mean, it just explodes. You know, it's exponential, and I think that's forgotten a lot, or it's not acknowledged as much as it should be.
Go ahead.
If we want to avoid toward the end of the project, we do a lot of work for the project by ourselves. We need more time to give feedback to all the consultants, and with three projects, sometimes we